Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Water Institute's Distinguished Lecture with Dianne Saxe. My name is Nancy Gaucher, and I'm a Knowledge Mobilization Specialist with the Water Institute. I'm joining you here in my home today, like many of you. I want to start today by acknowledging that we are participating from traditional territories of the First Peoples across the country. So here in Kitchener-Waterloo, where I am, I acknowledge that I'm on the Haldeman Tract, land that was promised to the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations of the Grand River. The Haldeman Tract is within traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. I would also like to encourage you to take a moment to recognize the land where you are. Today's format for the lecture will be quite simple. We're going to begin with Dianne Saxe's lecture and then followed by plenty of time for Q&A. So in terms of housekeeping, please add your questions to the Q&A box and not the chat box. This is going to help us sort through the questions that come in. And you can do this at any time through the talk. And like I said, we're going to get to those at the end. You can also use the chat box if you have any technical problems or if you have any general comments, and somebody from behind the scenes will respond to you. And finally, this webinar is going to be recorded and posted to the Water Institute's YouTube channel afterwards. So at this point, I would like to introduce Roy Brower. He's the director of the Water Institute.
Thank you, Nancy, and welcome everyone to this 2020 Water Institute RBC Distinguished Lecture. I'm very happy to have you here with us today. The lecture was actually originally scheduled on World Water Day early this year on the 20th of March, but obviously had to be postponed a couple of days prior to that event. It also marks our first event of the fall term, so we're very excited to have migrated to a new digital platform. Let me briefly introduce the Water Institute Distinguished Lecture Series to you. They've been up and running since 2013 when we were supported by the RBC Foundation with a very generous gift to support our innovative and interdisciplinary collaborative water program. And this is actually the 8th Water Institute RBC Distinguished Lecture since. To date, the gift has supported the education of almost 300 graduate students from across the 11 Waterloo departments and schools that jointly deliver the collaborative water program. In addition, over about 100 students have received almost 900,000 Canadian dollars in RBC water scholarships. The collaborative water program has been impactful in supporting students' scholarly success and has benefited immeasurably from the RBC's kind and generous support. So for today's lecture, distinguished lecture, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Dianne Saxe. Dianne Saxe is one of Canada's most respected environmental lawyers. She was the Environmental Commissioner in Ontario from 2015 to 2019. She was appointed unanimously by all MPPs to report to the legislature on Ontario's environmental, energy, and climate performance, and to be the guardian of the Environmental Bill of Rights. Dianne is now heading Saxe Facts, a business providing legal and strategic guidance on climate, energy, and environment, saxefacts.com, and hosts the Green Economy Heroes podcast. Without any further ado, I'm going to head over now to Dianne and let her share with us her experiences on how to inform policy with science. Dear Dianne, welcome, and the digital floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Roy. Hello, everybody. So, as Roy just said, I'm here to talk about the intersection between science and policy. And the bottom line lesson is, unfortunately, for those who make public policy, science is useful, but it's neither necessary nor sufficient. So I've got 3 stories to tell of cases that I personally have worked on in the last 45 years, a little bit of the theory about how environmental policy is made, and some ideas about how to inform policymakers with the science that you know. I'll be running through the slides very quickly, and I understand, Roy, that you'll be making the slides available to people later so that if they want to catch up on things, they can see them then.
Right.
So here are 3 of the stories I'm going to talk about. MISA, the Municipal Industrial Strategy for Abatement; dichloromethane, a chemical that used to be used a lot on paint stripping; and Aamjiwnaang, the First Nations Reserve in Sarnia, one of the most polluted places in Ontario. So first of all, let's talk about toxics in water. Now, this is something that was a very big issue a generation ago. Ontario's industry still discharges more than 50 toxic contaminants, including heavy metals and carcinogens, things that are persistent and toxic and that are easy to put into the water and very hard to get out, and that have enormous consequences on human health, environmental health, and so on. We have had some success. So in the 1980s, there was a huge amount of work done by scientists like you, and to prove the enormous harm that these chemicals were doing. And so we did indeed get a series of regulations. Now, the regulations were passed in the mid-1990s. They were based on 1980s science. They were designed to require 1980s technology. The idea was that the reasonable, best available commercial technology industries would have to install, and the government promised that they would virtually eliminate the discharge of persistent toxic substances into water as better technology became available. Well, they didn't keep that promise. Government after government, every party has had power since then, and none of them did it. The municipal regulations were never adopted, so it was the municipal industrial strategy for abatement. A lot of pollutants for water come through municipal sewage treatment plants. Those regs were never adopted at all. The industrial regulations have not been updated since that original work done in the 1980s. And so we still have persistent toxics pouring into Ontario waters, as I reported to the Ontario Legislature in November 2018. So, well, why? Well, I mean, the biggest reason was there hasn't been sustained public outrage. There certainly hasn't been any demand from industry. And the government claimed that the Toxic Reductions Act was going to solve the problem, which was a voluntary disclosure-based process. It was supposed to be market-based. Anyway, the Conservatives have repealed it entirely, effective next year, but it just hasn't done very much. For municipalities, there were some of the same reasons, but plus, municipalities can only clean up the pollution. One of the big things they need to clean up pollution from their sewage plants is money from the senior levels of government to build better sewage plants. And the senior levels of government, the province that passes the regulations, didn't want to provide the money. So they just didn't pass the regulations at all. Now, the government's justification, this is what they said back to me in response to my letter, was, oh, there's no problem. We control toxics and site-specific approvals. But in fact, they don't. They didn't provide any data. They don't collect data to check the claim. There are many outdated high-risk approvals, which I also reported back to the legislature, and they've done nothing to move towards virtual elimination, which is part of why there's still so many toxins going into drinking water. So takeaways from that is governments will ignore a lot of issues, including with some of the most toxic substances we know, especially if no one's making a fuss, especially if there's no clear evidence of current harm to the people who vote. But more fundamentally, the old saws, we can't manage what we don't measure, and government promises are often forgotten with time. Story number 2 is about dichloromethane. This was, again, a subject that there was a lot of concern about in the late 1980s when we were paying attention to toxics. And it was identified in 1993 as being a health risk, not in employment, but especially for people doing their own paint stripping. It wasn't a threat, according to Health Canada, in outdoor air because the sunshine breaks it down. But do-it-yourself people doing it in the basement, like me stripping an old chair as I used to do, there was significant exposure and there was a health problem. So Health Canada did that study, they passed it over to Environment Canada. So Environment Canada did classify dichloromethane as toxic under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, but then the question was, what do they do about it? Well, the answer was, well, maybe not the right things. So the first thing they did was they adopted this code of practice, and they ordered the industries who were using dichloromethane at work to prepare pollution reduction plans. But remember, I already told you in the previous slide, this wasn't a work exposure problem. this was a problem of people using it outside the workplace. So their action plan was all about the workplace. And sure enough, by 2010, they'd been able to dramatically slash dichloromethane use in workplaces, but without any evidence that the alternatives were better. For indoor use, do-it-yourself use, which was the problem, what they did was they published a brochure. Well, that didn't do much. Nobody checked to see if indoor air quality improved, and even the brochure you can't find anymore. So basically Canada didn't do anything. Other jurisdictions have taken action since then because there were a series of deaths of plumbers who were using it for bathtubs at clients' homes, but Canada still hasn't done anything. So illustration being, even if the government does take an issue seriously for a while, the policies they adopt may not have anything to do with what the actual problem was, according to science. They're often very happy just to say they did something, whether it works on the actual problem or not. Third case study is Amgenong. Now, this is a real heartbreak. As in so many parts of Canada, First Nations who lived in the Sarnie area were forced into a reserve in the area that the white settlers didn't want. So they were forced into this reserve down near the river, and steadily First Nations, the chemical plants were built around. There's about 57 major petroleum and petrochemical facilities around the reserve, and the Indian agents sold off more and more of the land so that more and more of these big petrochemical facilities could be built all around them. And they have soil contamination, they have air contamination. It's a very small First Nation. But that's what it looks like from the reserve. It's a poor community, and they had no champion, certainly not with the provincial government. First Nations reserves are simply not within the jurisdiction of the provincial government. And, whether or not this was motivated by racism, I don't know. But Amgenong became famous in public health circles from a study in 2005 that showed that this small community had twice as many girls as boys, as well as a very high disease burden. When I went down in the fall of 2017 to visit this reserve, the kindergarten class sang me O Canada in Ojibwe, and there were still 9 girls and 4 boys. So they've got very serious health challenges here. The air regulation that the province is so proud of was not protecting their health, and there were 3 big reasons for it. First of all, the sulfur dioxide standards were way out of date. Health Canada had reported that the standard needed to be, not just standard, the average air pollution had to be less than 40 parts per million if you wanted to avoid adverse health effects, including on the vulnerable. The province allowed 250. And more importantly, they didn't count a lot of things in that 250. They didn't count flaring emissions, which, as you see in the picture, which happened very frequently all year round. And even more fun, 57 petrochemical plants, and the province regulated each one to the 250 parts per million standard to the extent they did it all, and completely ignored all the cumulative impacts. So it was just no surprise that the people there were sick. And that led to a really very profound and prolonged and bitter conversation within the ministry and with industry as to whether emission standards had to be set to protect health. Now, this was the theory of the air regulation 41905, which was adopted, as you can tell, in 2005 to replace the old air pollution regulation, which had been in place a decade. And the theory of this regulation is that the standards, the general standards, should be based on health. And if a company cannot meet the health-based standards, and often they can't, they could apply for a technical or site-specific standard. In other words, an exemption for them because their technology is not good enough. Now, there was ferocious lobbying about this, especially by the Sudbury Mining Corporations, that they really furiously objected to the suggestion that what they were emitting was bad for health and they were just getting an exception, even though that is exactly what the law was doing. These trade-offs used to be made behind closed doors. Now they're more public. That makes them very political. Now, the I mean, you probably all know Sarnia and Sudbury are not very near each other. The air from one doesn't travel to the other. There's a lot of discussion of whether Sudbury should have its own rules, but there was just ferocious opposition. There was also a huge problem because of the enormous gulf of distrust between the ministry staff and the people in the community. After decades of being subjected to pollution, kept in the dark, being given unreliable warnings, no warnings, this tremendous reliance on self-reporting from industry, which frequently meant that actual spills weren't reported at all. And on top of that, all these plants were designed specifically, if they had a problem with toxics inside, they were designed to vent them outside, which was better for the employees in the plant, but worse for the people in the community, this poor community just downwind, who then received all those toxics. So it was very hard to build up some trust on this. And these young people are right. So at last, the government was embarrassed into action. I reported on this, as I say, in 2017. The Toronto Star had some articles about it. There were some TV pieces, and the government was embarrassed into action. And they finally said, okay, they would update the sulfur dioxide regulation. They would start counting flaring, at least to some extent. They would start counting cumulative emissions, if only for benzene, and they would phase in this more stringent requirement by 2023, another 5 years. I will say after the election, the government rolled even that back, the Conservative government, but at least there is some action, there is some monitoring, there are some improvements going on, and slowly it's getting better. I tell you this story because it's important to know that effective action is hard. It's usually slow, outrageously, heartbreakingly, tragically slow. But it is possible, even against this unbelievably ferocious industry opposition, when the science is very clear. Human health of people here is being harmed. And if there's persistent public outrage and media attention, to keep the promises from being forgotten. So how do you affect policy with the science that you're doing? And I can imagine that there might be some of you who want to persuade the province to put the money up to actually fund wastewater COVID testing to know when the prevalence is rising. That would be actually really useful. So how are decisions made? Well, it's messy. Really have to pay attention to who has influence, who decides. I mean, in theory, there's no difference between theory and practice, but in practice there is. So there are lots of theories about how good public policy is made or how public policy is made. This is one of the classic ones that you start with an agenda setting, political platforms and so on, and then people work away developing the policy, and then you get it approved, then you implement it, you evaluate it, and there is some of that. We also have a theory about the funnel. So think about what starts in the newspapers or people talking about, and you gradually create a public debate, and that affects the policy process, especially if there's a people lobbying for it, and you finally get a decision, although naturally there's lots of things that go wrong on the way. You can also think of it as a pyramid. If you work in the public service, there's a lot of fabulous people who work in the public service, and very often they feel pretty much as helpless and alone as everybody else. If you're at the bottom of this hierarchy, if you're a staff person and you know how important it is that we should be doing COVID testing in wastewater, well, you got a lot of people over you. You got to persuade before that becomes the law. And sometimes they'll listen to you, but a lot of the time they don't. It's also really important to pay attention to who does what. Many people who aren't involved in government tend to think of government as one big pudding that's all kind of meshed together. But actually, there are very clear turf lines for a lot of what matters. And so you need to know who has the right to make the decision you want made in order to influence the right person. The simplest division is between politicians and civil servants, and they have very different interests and incentives. In theory, the civil service is there to look after the public interest in the long run, which somehow they have to reconcile with the fact that they take their direction from the politicians who are elected every few years and who come and go and who often have very little understanding of the kinds of issues they have to manage. There's also a pyramid of laws. So each one depending on the other. So the Constitution sets out the general rules as to which level of government can do what and what kinds of things they can do. And then you have these whole cascading series of legal tools from laws, regulations, policies, guidance, permits, and then the whole questions around enforcement. There's a lot of jokes about this. If you'd like Laws and Sausages, you should never watch either one being made, was Otto von Bismarck's quote. There is a lot that's messy in the way that laws are actually made and actually enforced. It's just not as simple as it looks. But having said that, one of the real challenges for environmentalists and scientists is we tend not to want to get our hands dirty in that political process because it is difficult and often unpleasant and requires compromises that can be really hard to swallow. But it's the laws that determine the possibilities, set the rules, affect what everybody else does. And so we do have to be willing to get our hands dirty to some extent. We also have to pay attention to both formal and informal influence. I mean, there are all sorts of official rules about how decisions are getting made, but there's also a lot of questions about political culture and who do the powerful listen to, which may not be the people that you and I think they ought to listen to. Okay, get here. Oops, I'm having a computer problem. Hello, hello.
We can still hear you.
Okay, well, that's good. My screen is frozen. Not sure what I can do about that. And I can't even get out of this. All right, Roy, I apologize, but it looks as if I'm going to have to restart the computer. It's completely stuck. I'll be back.
Ali, can you maybe, we have a copy of your presentation. Maybe we can start that and share that. And then one of us clicks.
Ali, yeah, Ali, I can't even stop the screen share. Can you do that? Okay. Anyway, thank you. All right, I'm going to put you back there. All right, so now we're into how to inform policy, which is, I hope, what you want to know. Oh, okay, so where is science in that messy sausage that I talked to you about? It's changed a lot over my working lifetime. I mean, I started working for the Ontario government as a lawyer in January of 1974 or 5. Anyway, it's changed since then. We've had a huge decline in deference to all kinds of authority and to science. And in addition, there's an enormous and enormously powerful and well-funded campaign of doubt orchestrated by the tobacco companies, the fossil fuel companies, to specifically undermine faith in science and specifically to reduce the possibility of having a nonpartisan position based on science. That used to be widely accepted, that you could be nonpartisan and science-based, and that very concept has been under sustained attack, especially in the last decade or so. So science definitely can be a factor. It is still more credible if it's authoritative and nonpartisan, but the space for that is under active attack. We can't aspire really anymore to have politicians make evidence-based decisions. What we can aspire to realistically is having evidence inform their decisions. So at least when they make bad decisions, they should know the science, even if they choose not to follow it. The current provincial government has been particularly outstanding in its disregard for science, starting with the fact that one of the very first things they did their very first morning in office was to fire the chief scientist. And a long list of decisions since then that are not supported by evidence and directly in the teeth of the evidence. But nevertheless, they're in power. So these are three of the questions that I think you have to take seriously when you want to persuade a policymaker. The first one, and often the hardest, is can you even get my attention? The second one is, do I understand and believe you? And then why should I take this on right now? So policymakers are really busy. They are really busy. My whole career, any significant policymaker I ever knew always had a desk full of emergencies. And there is very little time left over when you're dealing with emergencies all day to deal with other things. Nobody actually had a sign like that on their desk, but it is hard to get attention. And we've had an enormous loss of institutional memory with the various purges and forced or encouraged retirements and ministry reorganizations and so on. So a lot of the time they don't know what they used to know. People are besieged with hundreds of urgent competing priorities. They've got fewer and fewer resources. They've got shorter and shorter tenures. I saw some really interesting data, even on, for example, ministers and deputy ministers who used to hold a post for long enough to get really expert on it. And now the average tenure of a minister is maybe a year and a half. So it's harder and harder for them to learn to understand the details and the culture of any particular area. And at the same time, there's been some hardening of institutional silos. So even getting to reach people is hard. Theoretically, we have a very open government, but again, one of the things I saw in 2019 was the budget cut to attend conferences, even to read journals. People were forced to cancel their subscriptions to journals. And so it can be harder and harder to actually get to see and talk with the people who are making the decisions. And there's also this question, do they want to know? It's much easier to get someone's attention if they know they have a problem. You can sometimes get it if they're in the general area of interest, but often people want to persuade a policymaker to take on a question or a topic that's just not already on their list, and they usually don't feel they have the capacity to take on yet another thing. It's also really important to always remember that politics are short-term. The public has a very short-term memory. Short-term pain for long-term gain, which is what a lot of good environmental and climate conduct is about. It's a tough sell in a short-term political environment, and same thing in many companies. Then there's assuming that you do manage to get access to somebody, this whole question of how can you say things so that they both understand you and believe you. So this is one of the acronyms that sometimes get used. Can you be an asset? Assume no prior knowledge. Simplify it. Show a picture. When I was commissioner, we spent an enormous amount of time trying to think of ways to describe the concepts with a graphic, with an infographic, some kind of a visual, because many people don't understand. Many people won't read long text documents, don't absorb a lot from them. We know that people absorb even less now reading on screens than they used to reading on paper. You've got to be able to get your key point across. Scientists know all the details, and we tend to get really excited about the nuance of the details, which can be very important. But if you can't get the basic story across, the details usually don't matter. And you have to be able to tell your story to many audiences. You've got to be clear, compelling in a way that people can widely accept it. And so, sure, you've all been taught about the importance of jargon, but also my experience of people coming straight out of, especially graduate school, is they've been forced to talk in jargon and passive verbs. And we spend a lot of time trying to strip that back out of new PhDs to get them talk in language that ordinary people can understand and relate to. It's also really important to remember that for most people, science in an area they don't already know is complicated, it's uncertain, it's incomplete, it's slow, it's hard, and there's always another opinion. And so when Greta stands up and says, follow the science, well, yes, but it's not that clear what the science says or what it means or what we're supposed to do with it. The biggest problem I have had with academics and scientists of all types is the so what question. I remember getting a report from a very learned hydrogeologist that said, oh yes, the groundwater movement is 10 to the -4. So? It's 10 to the -4! Okay, this was really a great significance to this person, but it didn't mean anything to anybody else. So, especially people who don't already agree with you, you're really going to have to think very hard as how to explain so what, which once you have that may give you the germ of the story. And being able to tell a story well, it's a skill. It takes time and effort. Kids are great for practicing on. If you get boring, they'll tune out fast. Ed Maybach is one of the great professors of climate communications, and I'm going to ask you, even though I can't hear you, I'm going to want you to read these, say these with me out loud. I want you to memorize these 11 words. Simple, clear messages. I don't see you talking. Simple, clear messages repeated often by a variety of trusted voices. Say it again. Simple, clear messages repeated often by a variety of trusted voices. This is how we get messages across. This is how everybody gets it across. Kindergarten teachers, everybody else. And those who are climate deniers should not be the only ones who know how to do this. So who are trusted voices? Well, all of you are trusted voices in some circles, but you also need to support other people who are trusted voices. And if I were to ask you, who is the most trusted profession in the world, the best evidence we have? Who do you think it is? I'll give you a clue, it's not lawyers or politicians. It's nurses, doctors, vets, other medical professions way up there. So can you provide a useful, simple, clear message to trusted voices like medical professionals, like nurses, like vets? Can you give them information that they can use in their work? Because they can reach people that you can't. It is harder to get people to believe you, for sure. We have, it's not just a rational question. We have really well established now that lots of people choose their beliefs, especially on climate and environmental issues, based on their identity, their group identity. What does their group hold to, not what does the evidence show? So there is a lot of challenge in how to provide information in ways that people can accept, that they can listen, that feel like common sense to them, that they can show or see or perceive in some way. And then, of course, there's the whole question of timing. Remember that the decision makers you're trying to reach are probably already struggling to keep up with all the things they already have to do. However busy and pulled in 27 directions you feel, the policymakers you're trying to reach probably feel that even more so, and especially political representatives. And so persuading them to take something on right now means thinking about why should this be their priority within the context of everything else they have to do? And is there a path to success? How risky is it? And is the time right? So this is one of the most important things to learn, is that in public policy, there are these policy windows. There's times that specific issues are being considered, and most of the time they aren't. So if you've got the greatest solution to slice bread, and slicing bread is not the problem that the policymakers are dealing with right now, then your solution is nice but not helpful and won't get acted on. So paying attention to when policy windows are opening and then providing your information then can make all the difference in whether or not you get heard, whether you get listened to, whether you have impact. And when you're thinking about the policy window, the decision maker has to think about, is this issue important? And if so, to whom? Is it urgent? Can we do something right now to affect it? Do we have everything we need, or is this basically a fool's errand? So these are some of the questions that I've seen policymakers wrestle with. Is there a practical solution? Can we afford it? Who will the winners and losers be? Who will speak up for it? Because generally what happens is the opposition speaks up vociferously, and those who will benefit just say, oh, that's nice, and don't say anything. And so this question of what will the political fight be like? Who will the allies be is really important to persuading a decision maker to take it on. There's a famous story of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he had a group of labor leaders came in to see him with some important initiative they wanted him to take on. And he listened to them very politely. And at the end, he said, great idea. Now go make me do it. Leaders can only do so much. It was their job to go and raise the public demand for it. And this question of risk is really important because politics is absolutely not a clean fight. It's definitely a winner takes all format. Also very often in the economy, innovation is often punished, especially for civil service and backbenchers. There's a real risk to sticking your head up. So when you're asking people to take something on, you've got to pay attention to the risk for them, not just the risk for society, and think hard about a way that makes it, gives them an on-ramp, gives them a safer way to do it. And when you're thinking about that, this Soul book by Stephen Covey is really useful. If you haven't read this book, definitely you should read it. First step in persuading other people is to understand where they're coming from. Before you seek to understand, be understood, you first have to understand that. So definitely a wonderful book and worth reading. So there's the takeaways. I told you I'd be rushing through these slides, so I'm sorry about that. But here's the takeaways. Most important thing if you want to influence a policymaker is to find a policy window. Find a time when the kind of issue you want to influence is on their agenda. Then you have to have a powerful, credible story. And you have to show them why they should take this on right now. And part of that is, who are the allies? Who's going to be demanding it? Do people understand it and want it? So thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Dianne. This is amazing and very well timed as well. So we are going to have the Q&A session now. We prepared some questions for you, Dianne, if you don't mind, just to warm up the discussion a little bit. It gives us a bit of time to look also in the Q&A box what kind of questions you're going to receive. I see that there are already 5 questions, and Nancy will help me to moderate those questions. But maybe I can just start off before we go to the questions in the Q&A. So you talked a lot about different pathways of influencing policy. Some researchers, and I guess I count myself into that category as well, are perhaps not so easy or feeling comfortable participating in a policy-making process because they maybe don't want to be perceived as being political and want to maintain their credibility as an unbiased scientist. How do you think they can participate while also maintaining their credibility?
This has been a real challenge. I'm particularly familiar with it on the climate side, as the climate scientists have felt that we do our work and publish our papers, we've done our job, and that other people should then be carrying it forward. And the result has been we've had a generation of knowing the science during which our climate pollution has gone up by 2/3. We're very close to the edge. I think that we need to pay attention to the difference between being involved in policy and being partisan. Now, this is a lawyer's definition, I suppose, but being partisan means you choose a party, a political party. You support a political party, you oppose a political party. And that being partisan does reduce your credibility for many people, particularly those who don't support that political party. But policy is a question of what good government should be. That's what government is. Government sets the laws and the policies, which has an enormous effect on all of us. And so I don't think there is any loss of credibility in working on policy. I think it's, if you're providing policy advice, it's valuable to provide it to all the parties at the same time. That was something that as commissioner, I was very careful to do. If I provided something, I sent it to all 4 parties. Usually only 1 or 2 read it, but they all got it. And there are different ways from different political points of view of looking at each of these issues, but we do share in common, and I am still hanging on to the threads of this, that it should be a common ground for every political party to want to sustain the natural systems on which our lives depend. There's no point having a political party if we're all dead. So I think it is possible to, and in fact essential, for those who really understand a particularly scientific area to be offering that expertise as they can into the policymaking process, recognizing that your expertise on what the problem is isn't necessarily going to tell you what the right answer is. Right? And that is certainly something to keep in mind, that there are often many other consequences and competing factors that may not be within your expertise. So you can only offer your expertise, what you know about your expertise, and have some humility about what the solutions are.
The reward system is maybe it also works two ways. The reward system on our side is maybe also not set up, at least traditionally, perhaps, to reward scientists for going out and speaking in public. We're being rewarded for publishing our stuff in journals that maybe not a lot of policymakers read. So maybe there is also something that could or should, and you actually see it already changing a little bit, to do policy relevant research. For example, interdisciplinarity is something that is nowadays highly valued in universities, but this policy involvement and engagement is something that is maybe something that could also be worked on a little bit more from the academic side.
Well, absolutely. I would love to see every academic institution, for example, require someone, and whenever they publish a paper, to have a so what summary in plain language. Mm-hmm. What did we learn and why does it matter?
Yeah.
In a language that everybody could understand, and that should be easily accessible. I mean, I know as commissioner, one of the things I tried to do was to figure out which of the universities had climate relevant current research that I could pass on to the appropriate ministries. And there was no easy way to find out. And so when I had somebody do a search for me, I got 700 titles, and it was mostly impossible to tell which ones would be useful.
Yeah, there is another alternative ranking. So there are academic rankings, but there's also the higher education ranking of, for example, climate action. And universities are actually ranked based on action-driven research. So there is, you see some changes also in how universities are being evaluated, but it's a gradual process, I guess, also on our side. Maybe one last question from my side, and then I'll hand over to you, Nancy. So, so public opinion is very important. You gave us an example of Roosevelt. Give me the tools to do what you want me to do. We live in a democracy. Public opinion plays an increasingly important and critical role in policy-making processes. Policymakers listen to the public. Do you think scientists can do a better job of influencing public opinion? And if so, maybe how?
Well, yes, absolutely. Scientists can and must do a better job influencing public opinion. Not everybody is going to want to or be able to do the sort of thing that Katharine Hayhoe has done. She is an outstanding example of a climate scientist who has learned how to communicate well with a wide variety of people in a very effective way. And she said that's a special talent. Not everybody has that talent and the emotional strength to do it, and be able to squeeze out that much time from family and her work and everything else that she has to do. But the scientists tend to be a little shy about talking in public about what they do and why they do it and why it matters. And so that's something that's a skill. It's not easy to learn. And it's something that the universities could absolutely provide enormous help in teaching people how to do that and building local coalitions so that you can provide that information to the activist groups who are in the business of influencing policy. I mean, that's the best thing you can do, is give them ammunition without having to be the activist yourself. Not many people have that skill. Lots of scientists are introverts. And that's one of the reasons that maybe you chose research. Don't want to be standing up in front of a group. That's fine. Nobody has to do everything. Nobody can do everything. The question is bringing the best of yourself and what you know into a place where it makes a difference. And often that's by helping someone else.
Yeah, so that's an excellent point. And I agree with you. It is a skill, but it's something that you can actually train. And you give me a very nice bridge to the collaborative water program that's funded by the gift from the RBC. We actually train our students in this interdisciplinary program to talk to policymakers. So actually last year or the year before, we had sessions where they present results of group work to representatives from different water authorities, for example. So they're forced to work together with different disciplines, but also they're taught to communicate messages in a clear and understandable way to these managers of our water resources. I'm going to hand over to Nancy. I see we have around 9 questions already, Nancy. Are you ready to pick one of them and we start off with that?
Yes, thank you, Roy. Yeah, I have lots of really great questions, but I think that this next question builds a little bit on what we've been talking about in terms of tools that researchers might be using to communicate with policymakers and politicians. So this question is specifically about what's the role of social media in influencing decision makers or public opinion. Do you have any comments on or tips on how you might use social media? Is that a good way to go?
Well, I, as a baby boomer, I'm not a digital native in social media, but yes, social media is increasingly important. It's important both in that social media is how an enormous amount of misinformation gets circulated, and scientists can play a really significant role in combating that misinformation and providing admittedly brief rebuttals and links. That is helpful. It's also true that first of all, an enormous number of people get their information from social media, and the conventional media get a lot of their leads from social media. So I do think that social media is a way to convey information, and it's not an equivalent, of course, to a published paper. But once you have published information or that is clear that you're satisfied with, the question is, how do you get it to people? Well, social media is one of the big ways to do that.
Great.
It does take a lot of time. Oh my goodness. And it takes training. When to use hashtags and when do you tag people? And I'm certainly not an expert on any of that, but I know it makes a big difference on how you get your message out. Similarly, podcasts. I mean, that's why I launched my podcast. It reaches a different audience, gets to tell a different story. And we have to use all the tools there are because we're really late in the game and we're losing.
Thank you. So maybe just a very quick one. The name of the scientist that you referred to before in the realm of climate change, that was Katharine Hagel, wasn't it?
Katharine Hayhoe, yes. Katharine with a Hayhoe. She's done a fabulous job. She's got a whole series of 8-minute videos that are partly cartoons, which are fantastic, getting across the basics of climate science. She's done a great job. Wonderful role model.
Okay, I hope that answers Sienna's question. I'm going to hand over again to you, Nancy. The next question, maybe.
This is an interesting question. So do you feel like advocacy groups such as the Extinction Rebellion hinder science-based policy? Because sometimes advocates have limited knowledge and are maybe doing actions that remain in the public mind longer than maybe something more science-based. So what are your thoughts on some of those groups and how they can work together with scientists?
So I used to be pretty skeptical about groups like Extinction Rebellion. I've got over it. I think that, as I said a minute ago, if you're in a championship game and it's late in the second half and you're losing, if you just keep doing your normal method, you're probably going to lose. You're already losing, and it's really so. what coaches have to do is try different things, try unexpected things, try something that might change the predictable path of the game. Well, it's like that for us on the environmental and climate crisis. We're really late in the game. We're losing badly. The consequences are enormous. So we have to try other stuff. And I think we now need everybody to do what they can. I think we need songwriters to write songs. I think we need artists to do art. I think we need Extinction Rebellion to block the streets. I think we need scientists to be doing science and then speaking up about it. We're going to need all of it. The window is closing. And what we have to lose is practically everything we care about.
Thank you, Dan. Nancy, maybe if I may make a suggestion. So there's a question from Alex Bilak. You've probably seen it, and he's actually referring to your field, knowledge brokers and knowledge mobilizer. What knowledge mobilization? Do you want to maybe address his question?
Yeah, he's wondering, some of these concepts that you've been talking about, it's not new, right?
It's not new.
We know that we need scientists to talk to policymakers, but maybe what is a little bit newer is this rise of a profession or rules for knowledge mobilizers or knowledge brokers. But that can be tough when budgets are really tight. So, do you have any examples of where or that come to mind where knowledge brokers have been really important or that have helped communicate this science to policy?
Well, we didn't have anyone with your title in our office, but that is exactly what I changed about the Environmental Commissioner's Office. I mean, I was the third permanent commissioner. The office was in place 25 years just before it was abolished. And yet, when I was appointed in 2015, most of the people of Ontario didn't know we had an environmental commissioner, didn't know we had an environmental bill of rights, and had never looked at any of the reports. And by the time Mr. Ford passed special legislation to abolish my office, the majority of people polled in the province recognized that the province would be worse off losing our office. So what made the difference? I mean, what made the difference was mobilizing knowledge. It wasn't that the technical content of the reports was any better. The reports had always been technically excellent. But the approach had been to write a technically excellent report, put it out the door, and expect the world to change. And that never worked at all. And the reports also tended to be very text heavy. They were almost like an academic journal. The last energy report before I was hired, the executive summary was 11 pages of tombstone. If there were 100 people in the province who read it, I'd be surprised. And so we didn't change the quality of the science. What we changed was choosing relevant topics, designing them with lots of graphics and key messages and so what, so that people could understand them, publishing them in formats from a very brief executive summary to a full report to a webinar to backup data, and then carrying that out across the province. I mean, in 2017, I think I gave 125 public talks. And that combination is what made our work relevant, made it matter, made it important to people, changed conversations, change the understanding of energy use and water in Ontario. So it's not easy, absolutely not easy. It was an enormous amount of work. And it also requires changing the allocation of resources. A lot of groups, and the ECO was like this, 95% of the money went into producing the reports. Okay, that's great, but it doesn't work that way. You can just get a mountain of reports and no impact. And so yes, work like yours, Nancy, has to be recognized as important as doing the good science is making it matter. Because otherwise all you have is good science that doesn't matter.
You're here. Excellent. Nancy, the next question maybe.
Yeah, there's also some sort of content questions. So we've been talking about process of the science policy process, but some people are also interested in your perspective on certain issues. So what is your thoughts on greenhouse gas policy, especially cap and trade and federal carbon pricing?
Oh, well, cap and trade worked really well. It was my job to report to the legislature to confirm whether the money had been used well and what the effectiveness was. And the auctions worked flawlessly and the money was used well and the impact was fast and exciting. And it was, from a policy point of view, it worked really well. From a public relations point of view, it was a catastrophe because it was really complicated. I once spent 45 minutes trying to explain the basic concept to a professor of business at the Rotman School. And at the end of that conversation, I thought, boy, this is just not going to work, right? If that kind of person with a one-on-one conversation, 45 minutes, cannot get the basic concepts, it's just not going to fly. It was chosen by, can I say this politely, geeks. It was chosen because it was the most economically efficient policy to achieve the job. It was optimized for effectiveness. It was not optimized for public understanding and support, and so it got trashed. The federal carbon price, and I've reported all this to the legislature, so if anybody's interested, this is all in my climate reports. The federal carbon price is not nearly as good from an effectiveness point of view. It costs more for less impact than cap and trade did, primarily because the money all goes back to households rather than going back into funding the green economy. Now, how effective it is in buying political support is unclear. Again, for administration reasons, for cost reduction reasons, they don't send people a check. It's just another line on the income tax return, which people don't understand. So the big advantage of the carbon price that the federal government designed should have been to buy political support. But again, when I went around the province, I asked people how many of them had got this money back from the federal government. Most of them didn't know they'd got it. Although in fact, we know they virtually all had received it. So, when you judge a policy, the question always is, what are we judging it against? Are we judging it against how it helps us progress towards a low carbon economy? Are we judging how it progresses towards political understanding and support? Well, those are very different things. And I got my knickers in a complete knot at one point about, in retrospect, a small change in the policy of the California Air Resources Board with whom we were linked, which under certain circumstances could have undermined the legitimacy of the program. And I really got myself very upset about it. But in retrospect, it didn't matter at all, because having a system, however imperfect, was a lot better than not having a system. And right now, we don't have any coherent climate policy. Anything that was moving us in a direction towards reducing our climate footprint, the 752 clean power projects that were canceled, the increasing the speed limit, driving a highway through the green belt, undermining the Endangered Species Act, and so on and so on and so forth. So there is also that question about the perfect being the enemy of the good. I having been a lawyer a long time, I would love it to be perfect. At this point, I'm saying, I've had that beaten out of me. We need stuff that's going to work, and we need it fast, and it's not going to be perfect, and we're just going to have to live with that.
Yeah, that's a great example of how complicated policymaking can be, because focusing just on great policy and incorporating great science into great policy is not always, it's not the complete story. You need a policy that resonates with people, that people can understand.
If they're paying attention to it. I mean, this is one of those things, again, we had this little accident that changed our history. Patrick Brown was the leader of the Conservative Party. Every candidate for the Conservative Party signed commitment to support a carbon price in Ontario. And then his personal history resulted in the putsch in the Conservative Party, and we ended up with the current premier, and it all went to hell. So sometimes little accidents make a big difference in what happens.
We have another context question from Terry, the one who welcomed you at the beginning. Do you want to take that one, Nancy, maybe at the top? Terry Rees. It's a very technical one. You maybe have to read it out loud.
Right. So Terry actually has a background consulting with Ontario Industries about the liquid industrial waste regulation 309 and MISA in the 80s. He says that both clarity and the threat of fines and charges actually elicited a lot of activity and improvement when it was actively enforced. So do you have any thoughts about taking creative approaches? So maybe using a different level of government, maybe like, for example, driving toxin regulations through municipal sewer bylaws with associated charges that also help municipalities pay their treatment costs. So the regulator, like cities, would have incentive and multiple benefits to actually enforce these things. And then industry would be obliged to pay for monitoring and self-monitoring needs, oversight, obviously.
Oh, well, you're putting a lot in there. I would start with data. It seems to me that we should now, with ubiquitous smartphones and IT and so on, have a tremendous opportunity to allow citizens to collect enforcement relevant data. So one of the examples of that I think we can all learn from is Linda Lucas at Environment Hamilton managed to cobble together a few $100s to buy portable air quality monitors. And she trained low-income people in one of the most polluted areas of Hamilton and let them borrow these monitors and walk around their neighborhoods and watch the air quality and keep track. And that's been really valuable in gathering a much better picture of the air quality, because before that what would happen was the residents would complain. Eventually the ministry would send an officer out. The officer would take a sample. Okay, but we're talking about intermittent pollution. It depends on what's happening in the plant that day. It's depending on the air direction. It's depending on all kinds of things. So most of the time, the officer will find nothing. So the officer will come out once if you're lucky, twice if you're lucky, maybe 3 times. And if they don't find anything, they say there's no problem. But for the people who live there, even if it's only 10% of the time that you have lung damaging air pollution there, that's enough to damage their lungs. So allowing a public science to collect good data can make a big difference in what happens. We see this in biodiversity. There's a lot of citizen science apps for people to take a picture of a snake or a butterfly or a bird, which then goes into a decision useful data because qualified biologists can cross-check the identifications and make sure you really have identified the right kind of snake. And I think there's got to be some equivalent like that for water, that lots of people, I mean, there's no urban stream that doesn't have people walking by it. If there was some easy way of taking thousands, tens of thousands of samples to say, we have a big problem here, or this is getting better, in some way that people could actually see. Because I remember I mentioned how important it is to make it concrete. If you give people something concrete they can do, they're much more likely to get engaged, and that's a better story for the media, and that's more likely to lead to action. So if you have the ability to invent an easy, reliable detection system, data collection system that all your students could adopt and could have other people do, you've got a much better chance of then creating the situation, whether you're going to the city to enforce something or even to the ministry. When they have lots and lots of reliable data, it's much harder for them to ignore something. When they just have complaints, it's easier.
Well, that sounds like a challenge, and perhaps Waterloo, being an innovative university, might step up to the challenge and invent something that can do that. There's another question here about, scientists. Sometimes they're in their labs and they're at their computer, they're at their desks, and they're not always getting a lot of opportunities to meet people who produce the policy. So then they don't get that insight into actually what's happening. What are the motivating forces? Where, to monitor when policy windows actually open. So how do we, have you seen any good examples, or do you have any ideas for how to engage researchers and policy developers?
Right, so I've got two suggestions. One suggestion is the Environmental Bill of Rights. Now, certainly the bill has been weakened by this government, but still, one of the things that I extracted a promise, which was kept from the Deputy Minister of Environment, that they would upgrade the software that's used for the Environmental Bill of Rights. So you can now go to the Environmental Bill of Rights website and put in a keyword. So if your interest is in, I don't know, Blanding's turtles, for example, you can put in the keyword Blanding's turtles and you will get an email to your email box whenever there is a proposal about Blanding's turtles. And so if you had expertise about Blanding turtles, that would then give you an opportunity to, so for example, if they post a notice that they're thinking of a regulation or they're thinking about a permit to somebody to do something that might affect the turtles, there's always the name and contact information of someone on that form. So that's a person you could then reach out to say, I see you're working on something about Blanding's turtles. I'm an expert on Blanding's turtles. You know, what kind of information would be useful to you, or, you know, you could provide your information. So that's one way. Sign up for the Environmental Bill of Rights automatic notices and get an email directly to you. That works if you've got a narrow expertise. If your expertise is water, you will get deluged in emails and it just becomes spam at that point. So the other possibility is to make a connection with an NGO and a non-governmental group that is already interested in some topic that you're interested in. So that might be environmental justice. If you're in Hamilton, it might be Environment Hamilton if you're interested in things that affect the local water quality. And their part of their modus vivendi is to pay attention to policy windows and to communicating with decision makers. And so what I would then suggest you would do would be to reach out to, in Hamilton, Linda Lukasek, and say, all right, I am an expert in Blanding's turtles. And I'm interested in providing support if there's any initiatives that will either hurt or help Blanding's turtles. This is the kind of work I do. This is why it matters. Remember, you're going to practice your so what by then. And then you're giving them something to work with in their general work, because they're doing much more of that political awareness and outreach than you are. So either sign up for it yourself or find a group who's already working on this and offer them your expertise.
Good. There are a few more questions left. Nancy, do you want to maybe
Sure, I
move
think
to the...
Diane's touched on some of these in slightly different ways. But maybe this one question has a little bit more. So it might be worth talking about the time commitment that's required to do some of this work. So, you know, as scientists to add public communication and to figure out why it matters and to sort through, you know, the key messages and find ways of delivering it can take a lot of time. And sometimes the trade-off is work that is building your credibility. So like publishing papers and maybe, you know, getting those credits for conferences to present it at. So basically what you're asking is for researchers to volunteer their time to do this extra work. So do you have any thoughts on how to maybe balance some of that?
I don't have a magic answer for that. You're absolutely right, Simon. That's a very, very fair question, especially if you have small children. And a lot of people early in their career are doing exactly that. They're you know, trying to build up the scientific credibility and at the same time raise children, and with all the difficulties. And I have two daughters in that exact position as well. So no, I don't have a magic answer. Certainly I have always done a lot of stuff at peculiar hours. And if you ask my children, I'm sure they will tell you that there was a lot of time they wanted me that I was working. So it isn't easy. But I still think that there is, I think you can choose a little bit of time to build this other kind of credibility. I mean, learning how to communicate effectively with the public as opposed to in the normal academic regime, I think will also be good for your credibility, because even professors respond better, in my experience, to very clear messaging. Even though they've tried to force you to speak in the passive verse and have 27 qualifiers in the sentence, they still actually respond better to a clear sentence. Maybe not in a paper, but at least in a communication. So if you think about this as part of building your credibility and your brand, is learning why your stuff matters and how to communicate it clearly to people at all levels. I think that can help a little bit in choosing how you do the time allocation. I agree with you that you should also be asking your institution to value spending some percentage of time on those questions. Why does this matter and how do we communicate it? Because otherwise, what is the institution doing? You can't do that individually. You can only do that in cooperation with your institution. But you could ask your professor or your student union or other group, how do we get some support and recognition for this work? Because science doesn't change the world by itself.
I think that's,
Thank you.
Yeah, you can also practice on your kids. They're really generally very tough audiences.
Yeah. Nancy, I think we're coming to the end of the session. I think you've more or less addressed the questions also by Rob, for example, on the importance of not just publishing in a scientific journal. You see another question, last question that you would like to see addressed by Dianne?
Well, I see two here that I can try to quickly say. I mean, what about metrics? Metrics are not generally what people want to hear in the first story. Sometimes you get a really good metric. So for example, when we were looking at water taking by big bottling companies, people were able to relate to the fact that the province was getting 37 cents for 100,000 liters of water, which was all being sold in plastic bottles. So sometimes you'll get a very small number like that. People remember $16 orange juice. They will remember some relatable single facts, but mostly metric kinds of questions are not what they're interested in the first time. They can be helpful in the second and third level discussion, but they're not what makes the story compelling usually, unless it's as I say, a simple eye-catching number. And the choice of which metric, well, I just go back to what is it that they're interested in, or who are the stakeholders who are going to speak about it, and which kind of things have emotional resonance. There's no magic answer to it, but just because a metric is standard in your field does not mean it's going to be meaningful or persuasive to anybody else. If you have a crotchety great aunt, or anybody or a really crotchety teenager, some people probably know a crotchety teenager, you could try telling them your elevator pitch. If they don't understand it or relate to it, you know it isn't right. In terms of Bereket's question, what do I think that scientists' results become partisan because the research results point to a specific policy decision? Well, absolutely, I recognize that. And you do have exactly that kind of problem. For example, the work of Climate Interactive, which has a fabulous simulator on climate policy tools, points very clearly to really why we need carbon pricing and how difficult it will be to achieve good results without it. So you are correct that people who don't like that policy answer will often attack the science or the scientist or the method that leads to that result because they don't like the conclusion. There's no magic answer to that. It can be helpful to have some humility about how you present this. This is the question that we asked. This is how we know that this is a reliable way to answer that question. This is what we found about it. There's almost always some other way. So even the carbon pricing example I just gave you, it just shows you that if we don't have carbon pricing, it's going to be very, very, very difficult. It's going to be, much, much, much more expensive. There's going to be much more climate damage. There are always other choices. So sometimes the method of presentation can help a lot. in that problem. But there's no way to make climate positive science conclusions clear without getting attacked by certain kinds of people. Every time I'm on BNN Bloomberg, I get an angry email from some man in Alberta, always a different one, with generally some completely scientifically illiterate comment. Sometimes you can't persuade people. You can only do your best. Have I got to most of the questions to some extent?
Yes, a new one just came in about not being an environmental scientist, and you liked the comment that you made about busyness. I think we've gone through most of them. What do you think, Nancy?
I think so.
There's one more on COVID. So someone expects funding cuts. So where do you think urban water management governance and implementation is heading? Is stormwater and wastewater management still a priority in your view?
Well, I think that we have, certainly the municipalities across Canada are in dire financial straits. And they also bear the largest brunt of climate damage. So I think we're going to have, really, really painful, awful, terrible cuts as a result. In terms of stormwater, the thing that may keep it on the radar is that one of the consequences of climate change is more flooding and more devastating flooding, and it's also affecting the economics for insurance companies. And so we are, the insurance companies already told me a year and a half ago that they now see 10% of Canadian properties as soon being ineligible for private sector flood insurance. Well, if you can't insure your house, it may not have any resale value. So there's huge economic consequences coming to flooding, and that may keep stormwater management somewhat on the radar. It doesn't help that the provincial government has eliminated the funding for the Clean Water Act, and so sooner or later we'll see another problem in that area. But that is an area where the connection between stormwater management and flooding, it's perfectly obvious to anyone who pays attention. There's lots of people who don't know that. And there is a lot of interest also in making natural solutions part of that story. That's again a story that people need to know. And what the UK found is that focusing on natural solutions that made people's life better in the shorter run, people liked having a park near them, even if it was mostly a stormwater basin that was green. And so finding ways that provide short-term concrete benefits, again, that people can see and touch, that also help provide stormwater management, maybe can get there. And if the last person's question, what about how can I lift up people who know the science? Well, again, there's no magic answer, but the more the scientists learn to say, so what? To really work hard on why does this matter? What is this good for? And who else could it be useful to? The easier it'll be for you to help the person who's going to be a political worker to find the right folks. I would also encourage you to make friends. I mean, especially when you're young, it's easier. Make friends in other fields. If you're a water scientist, do you have a friend who's a lawyer? Do you know anybody who's an engineer or a nurse? Really seek out people in different professions who have different kinds of problems and see if you can exchange viewpoints. They may be able to use what you know. They may have problems that you haven't thought of. And having those personal connections can make all the difference. And you're at the stage in life where it's easier to do.
This is an excellent bridge again to our collaborative water program, Dianne. Thank you so much. This is exactly what we're trying to achieve by putting students from different departments, engineering, science, arts, environment, mathematics together in one room and work as groups, interdisciplinary groups on all kinds of water challenges. I'm afraid that we will have to leave it at this. Dianne, thank you so much for these incredible insights. This has been very useful, very interesting. Thank you very much for sharing your insights with us today. Thank you, Nancy, for helping to moderate this lecture. Thank you all who are still online for participating, your interest in this Water Institute RBC Distinguished Lecture. I also have to thank my other Water Institute colleagues who work behind the scenes on the production of this lecture. We look forward to see you all again. Ali already put a link in the chat box. We're hosting an international interdisciplinary research conference end of this month, 29th and the 30th of September, and on the 1st of October, and it's all about achieving the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal number 6 in a post-COVID area. As I mentioned, you can find the link in the chat box to register. Alternatively, just visit our website at uwaterloo.waterinstitute. And normally we would have a small reception after the RBC Distinguished Lecture where you could all share impressions and discuss further on the presentation. This time we unfortunately just have to leave the meeting and go on with the rest of our day. Stay in touch with us, stay in touch with the Water Institute, follow our events and programming on our website, and I hope you all have a good rest of the day. Stay healthy and safe. Thank you all very much for participating, and thank you once again, Dianne, for being with us today.
Good luck to everybody, and thank you for having me. And I didn't even have to get all the way to Waterloo.
There are some advantages. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.